The champagne flutes were still ringing when my father ruined the night. Not my wedding, Ava's engagement party, but that toast was aimed at me. 40 people in the ballroom of the Ashford family's country club in Greenwich, Connecticut. White linens, low flowers, the kind of room that costs money just to breathe in. My father stood at the head of the table, his second glass of Bordeaux in hand, his voice carrying the way it always did when he had an audience he wanted to impress. He had been talking about Trent Ashford for 2 full minutes. The Ashford portfolio. The Ashford developments along the eastern seaboard. The Ashford family's century of Connecticut real estate, their name on 3 buildings my father had probably tried to get into at some point in his career. He was glowing. He was warm. He was the father I remembered from Ava's piano recitals and her college graduation, and every other moment she had given him something to stand behind. Then he glanced at David. Just a glance, the kind that takes half a second and does a decade of damage. At least one of my daughters married someone who owns more than a tractor. The laughter came fast, the easy kind, the kind that fills a room before anyone has decided whether something was funny. My mother covered her mouth with her fingers, not to hide shock, but to hide how hard she was laughing. I could see her shoulders moving. Ava, seated beside Trent, looked down at her champagne flute and smiled at the tablecloth. She did not correct him. She did not even flinch. David sat still. That was the thing about David Wilson that my family had never understood and probably never would. He did not react the way they expected. No jaw tightening, no color in his neck, no reaching for his water glass to give his hands something to do. He just sat there with his work-calloused hands flat on the white linen, his posture the same as it had been all evening. Unhurried, composed, taking up exactly the space he needed and not 1 inch more. The stem of my champagne flute cracked. I did not realize it had happened until I felt the sharp edge against my palm. I set the glass down carefully, angled it so the crack faced the table, and said nothing. Nobody noticed. The laughter was still moving through the room in waves, people leaning toward each other, one of Trent's cousins repeating the punchline to someone who had missed it. Under the table, David's hand found mine. His palm was warm, dry, absolutely steady. He leaned toward me just enough and said 2 words so quietly that I almost missed them under the noise of the room. Soil remembers. I thought I understood what he meant. I would find out later that I had only understood half of it. My name is Hillary Williams. I am 33 years old. I run an agricultural sustainability consulting practice out of a converted barn in upstate New York, which means I spend my days testing soil composition and writing reports that help farmers transition to regenerative methods. And my evenings on a porch that overlooks fields I have come to love more than any room I grew up in. I have been married to David for 18 months. My family has spent most of those 18 months making clear, in the particular way that well-bred Connecticut families make things clear, that they consider this a mistake. I had hoped tonight might be different. I had been wrong before. The first chance I got, I followed my mother into the hallway outside the ballroom. The door swung shut behind us and the noise dropped to a murmur, all that polished laughter muffled by 2 inches of solid wood. The hallway smelled like old carpet and hothouse flowers, and the faint chemical sweetness of whatever Laura Williams used to stay 59 forever. That was cruel, I said. My mother turned, and her expression was the one I knew best. The patient, slightly pained look of a woman who had spent decades managing things that should not require managing. Your father was making a joke, she said. Don't be so sensitive. He called my husband a punchline in front of 40 people. Hillary. She said my name the way she said it when she wanted to close a conversation. David is lovely. He is perfectly lovely. But you have to admit, the optics aren't exactly what we had hoped for. The optics. That was the word she chose. Not my feelings, not David's dignity, not the fact that the man she was describing as lovely had just been used as the setup to her husband's joke in front of everyone they knew. The optics. What you had hoped for, I said, not what I hoped for. She reached out and patted my arm, 2 light taps, the gesture of a woman who had learned that touch could end an argument faster than words. Come back inside, she said. Ava's about to cut the cake. The door opened and the noise came back all at once. The clink of silver on glass and someone calling for another toast. And then the door closed again, and I was standing alone in the hallway with the carpet and the hothouse flowers and the muffled sound of my family celebrating without me. I heard the applause from where I stood. We drove home in David's truck, the old one, the one with a crack in the dashboard and a heater that took 20 minutes to find its footing. He drove the way he always drove, both hands on the wheel, the radio off, comfortable with quiet in a way I had never quite managed. 10 miles passed. 12. The highway gave way to county roads, the lights of Greenwich dissolving behind us. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "Don't apologize for them." He kept his eyes on the road. "And don't apologize for choosing me." I looked at his profile in the dark, the long line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, that quality he had that I could never find the right word for. Not calm exactly. More like a man who had heard worse and had decided somewhere along the way that worse was not going to move him. He had heard worse. I knew that much. I just did not know yet from whom. The farmhouse was not grand. It was not meant to be. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, windows that rattled when the wind came down from the north. Clean and warm and real in a way that the Ashford family's Greenwich Country Club, for all its white linen and low flowers, had never managed to be. David went to check on the greenhouse. He always did, last thing, a habit so settled it had become part of the architecture of our nights. I sat on the porch steps and took out my phone. Ava had posted 40 minutes ago. Instagram, public account. The one with 260,000 followers who loved her for her life's particular glow. A carousel of photos from the party, the ballroom, the champagne. Trent's hand on her waist, my parents beaming in the golden light. My mother looked radiant. My father looked like a man who owned the room, which, for an evening, he had. I scrolled through every frame. Not one of them had David in it. Not one of them had me. The caption read, "My sister found her prince," with a champagne glass emoji and a small gold crown. I sat with that for a moment. The field in front of me was dark, the corn in the lower acres just visible against the sky, growing things you could not see yet, but that were happening anyway, underground, in the cold. I closed the phone. It was not sadness that settled in my chest. I had been sad before, plenty of times, over my family and what they could not seem to give me. This was something older than sadness, something that had been there a long time, quiet and patient, waiting for me to stop explaining it away. I had not been forgotten from those photographs. I had been left out of them. There is a difference. I was only beginning to understand how much. 3 weeks passed before I did something I would spend the next 6 months second-guessing. I called my mother and invited them to the farm. It seemed reasonable at the time. More than reasonable, actually. It seemed like the mature thing to do, the kind of gesture that demonstrated I was not holding a grudge, that I understood my parents were complicated people who loved me in the particular limited way that they had always loved me, and that I was willing to keep showing up because that is what you do with family. You show up. You extend the hand. You give them the chance to see what you have built, and maybe, if you are lucky, to understand why you built it. Laura picked up on the second ring. "We'd love to," she said, in the tone she used when she was already calculating the cost of saying yes. "But Ava's wedding planning is consuming everything right now. There's the venue walkthrough and the florist consultation, and she wants me to look at invitation samples this weekend. So honestly, the timing is 8 months away, Mom." A pause. The particular pause my mother used when she was deciding between what she wanted to say and what she would actually say. "Fine," she said. "We'll come Saturday. But your father has a call at 2, so we can't stay the whole afternoon." They arrived at 11 in John's silver Mercedes, which he kept showroom clean the way some men kept trophy cases. My mother stepped out wearing white linen to a working farm in late October, and looked around with the expression of someone trying very hard to find something to compliment. Ava climbed out of the back seat with her phone already up, filming. Not for us, for her followers. The farm as content. The farm as proof of something she had not yet decided how to caption. David met them at the gate. He had been up since 5, the way he always was. His boots were muddy and he had not changed them, which I loved him for because it was exactly who he was. a man who did not perform cleanliness for guests, who assumed that if you came to a farm you expected to encounter a farm. He shook my father's hand and walked them out toward the lower fields where the cover crops were still green, and he talked the way he could talk when he wanted to, about soil biology and nitrogen cycling and the economics of regenerative agriculture, using the vocabulary of someone who had spent 12 years studying and practicing something he genuinely believed in. My father walked with his hands in his jacket pockets. "So what's the revenue on something like this?" he asked. Not curious, assessing. The question he asked about everything eventually. "Enough," David said. John laughed. It was not an unkind laugh exactly. More. The laugh of a man who found the answer slightly ridiculous. "Enough doesn't pay for college," he said. Ava was filming the greenhouse. When they came back inside, Laura paused in the front room and looked at the framed aerial photograph on the wall above the fireplace. David had hung it there the first week we moved in a large print maybe 30 inches across, showing farmland from above, field after field, pale and dark in alternating bands, stretching to what looked like the edge of the world. "That's a lovely print," my mother said. "Is that Kansas?" "That's ours," David said. She smiled at him, polite and unconvinced, and moved toward the kitchen to wash her hands. I set lunch on the table at noon. I had been cooking since early morning. Roasted squash from our own garden braised greens, a chicken I had spatchcocked and rubbed with herbs David grew in the greenhouse, a loaf of bread I had made the night before because I wanted them to walk into a house that smelled like something, like effort, like care. Ava looked at the spread and leaned toward my mother and said, in the voice people use when they think they are whispering, "Can you imagine living here? Like, full time?" Laura made a small non-committal sound. My father waited until we were most of the way through lunch to bring up the deal. He did it casually, the way he always introduced things he wanted you to think he was not that invested in. He had been talking about a development project of Trent's, something along the waterfront in New Haven, and then he set down his fork and said, "I'm actually in conversations with a major agricultural firm right now. Could be the one that turns things around. The right partnership at the right moment, that kind of thing." He did not name the firm. He did not elaborate. He picked his fork back up and returned to Trent's waterfront project as if he had mentioned nothing more consequential than the weather. I looked at David. His expression did not change, not by a fraction. He reached for his water glass, took a sip, set it back down in the same ring on the tablecloth, and asked my father a polite question about the New Haven development. Something in the back of my mind noticed the way David had not reacted. I filed it away without knowing why. 2 weeks after the farm visit, Ava posted from a yacht. I was sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, my boots still on from a site visit I had wrapped up an hour earlier, a mug of coffee going cold in my hand, reviewing notes on my tablet for a client report that was due Friday. The notification came through on my phone. Ava Williams posted a story, and I opened it the way you open things you already know will cost you something. The yacht was large. The water behind it was very blue. The light had that quality that only happens in October on the Sound, low and gold and ruthlessly flattering. My mother was laughing at something off camera, one hand raised to keep her hair from blowing across her face. My father had his arm around Ava, the loose, comfortable arm of a man entirely at ease with where he was and who he was with. Trent was there, and 2 of his sisters, and the Ashford parents, and a woman I recognized as one of my mother's friends from the garden club. 6 frames. A video of the wake behind the boat, all white churn and blue water. A final still of champagne glasses raised, 8 people, the caption reading "Family Goals" with the champagne emoji. I was not in any of it. I screenshotted every frame. I did not call. I did not text. I sat on the porch until the coffee was fully cold and the light had gone flat and the field in front of me had turned from gold to gray, and I let the knowledge settle into the place in my chest where I had been keeping things like this for a long time. She had not forgotten to include me. That would have been easier, somehow, an oversight, a thing that could be explained away. She had posted about family and had not included me in the definition. There is a difference between being forgotten and being excluded. I had known the difference for years. Seeing it documented in 6 frames and a video made it something I could no longer argue myself out of. The consulting practice was going well. That fall, I had taken on 3 new clients, all mid-size operations, making the transition to no-till methods. And the work was interesting in the way that work is interesting when you are actually suited to it, demanding and absorbing and occasionally surprising. I was building something. It was not the something my family had expected from me, but it was real, and it was mine, and on most days that was enough. On most days. The charity gala invitation arrived via my cousin's social media post. Not directly to me, not a call from my mother, not an envelope in the mail, not even a text, a photograph on my cousin's Instagram story. The Williams family dressed for an evening out black tie, the kind of event where my mother shone brightest, surrounded by the women she had spent 30 years cultivating into something she called her circle. My mother was in burgundy. She looked stunning. The caption said, "Cannot wait for tonight with a string of stars." I called her that evening. Was I supposed to get an invitation? I asked. I kept my voice even. I had been practicing keeping my voice even for most of my adult life. Darling. The pause before that word was half a second too long. It's black tie. I didn't want to put David in an uncomfortable position. You could have asked me, I said. You could have called and asked whether David and I wanted to come. I'm asking you to understand, she said. These things have a particular. You didn't want a farmer at your event, Mom. You can just say that. She did not say that. She said something about the seating arrangements and the committee's expectations and how next year things might be different. And I listened to all of it with the phone pressed against my ear and my free hand flat on the kitchen counter, and when she had finished I said that I understood and hung up. My hands were shaking, not from anger. Though there was anger, there was plenty of it. The shaking was from the effort of not saying the thing I had wanted to say, which was that I was her daughter, and I had been her daughter for 33 years. And in all of that time, I had never once asked her to be someone other than who she was. The thought I did not say out loud. I was done asking her to return the favor. 2 weeks after the gala, my father called. He called on a Tuesday morning when I was between site visits, parked on the shoulder of a county road with a coffee going warm in the cup holder, reviewing the previous client's soil report on my tablet. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered because I still did, then because hope is a habit harder to break than most people admit. There's a junior position opening up at Williams Capital, he said. He led with it, no preamble, the way he led with things he had decided were already settled. Marketing division. It's beneath your qualifications, I understand that. But it would give you a real salary, a real trajectory. And David could keep a pause, just long enough to be deliberate. Garden. It's a farm, Dad. Hillary. His voice had the patient quality my mother's had, but underneath it was something harder. I'm trying to help you, before it's too late. Before what's too late, I almost said. Before I'm too far gone into a life you've decided doesn't count? I appreciate the thought, I said instead. Do you? He said. Because it doesn't feel like you do. I told him I had a site visit in 20 minutes, which was true, and ended the call, and sat on the shoulder of the county road for another 5 minutes with the coffee going cold and the tablet sitting dark in my lap. Thanksgiving came. We drove 2.5 hours to Greenwich because I was still trying. That is the honest version of it. I was still trying, still showing up, still operating on the assumption that if I kept extending myself, someone would eventually meet me in the middle. David came without complaint. He always did. Trent was already there when we arrived, seated at the center of my father's attention, the two of them deep in a conversation about commercial real estate that had clearly been going for a while. Trent was easy with my father the way that men are easy with men who find them impressive, relaxed, expansive, laughing at the right moments, asking questions that let my father demonstrate what he knew. When we sat down to dinner, David was placed at the far end of the table. Not beside me, not across from me. At the far end, in the seat nearest the doorway to the kitchen, between my aunt's husband, who had been half-deaf since a construction accident in the 90s, and the card table extension, where the 3 youngest grandchildren were staged with their plates. I watched my mother direct the seating with the efficiency of a woman who had been orchestrating these moments for decades and knew exactly what she was doing. David sat down. He unfolded his napkin. He was entirely unbothered. I did not have his capacity for that. I never had. Ava gave the toast. She stood with her wine glass raised and her hair perfect and her voice carrying the warmth she could perform as naturally as breathing, and she said she was grateful for this family, for parents who had shown her what real success looked like for a partner. Here she looked at Trent, who shared those values for a future she could not wait to build. She looked at me when she said real success. Just a glance, not long enough to call out, but deliberate. I saw it. I knew she meant me to. John raised his glass. Around the table, glasses rose. At the far end, David drank quietly and set his glass back down and cut his turkey with the same even attention he gave everything. Nobody looked at him. For the length of that meal, he was not there. Driving home afterward, I lasted 40 minutes before I said it. I'm done trying. David drove without answering for a moment. The highway was mostly empty, the headlights finding the road in long, pale wedges. What does that mean? He said finally. It means I stopped going to their events. I stopped calling. I stopped showing up and pretending that one more time will be the time it's different. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not respond at all. Before you do that, he said, there's something I need to tell you. I looked at him. His eyes were on the road. What? I said. Not tonight. He said it gently, not to put me off, more like a man who understood that some things needed daylight, needed the person receiving them to be in a condition to hear them. Tomorrow, when you're ready. I turned back to the window, the dark fields moving past, bare now, harvested and silent. I was not ready, I knew that much. But whatever David was holding, he had been holding it carefully, and that meant it was heavy, and that meant that by morning, whether I was ready or not, everything was going to be different. He did not tell me that night. I lay awake in the dark, listening to the farmhouse settle around me, that particular language of old wood and cold air that I had come to know the way you come to know any voice you hear every night. David slept beside me the way he always slept. On his side, one arm folded under the pillow, his breathing slow and even. I watched the ceiling and tried to imagine what he needed to tell me that required daylight and readiness, and every answer I came up with felt wrong in a different way. In the morning, he made coffee. He set a mug in front of me at the kitchen table and sat down across from me and looked at me the way he looked at things he was taking seriously, which was the same way he looked at everything. Not yet, I said before he could start. He waited. My father is going to call today, I said. I can feel it. He always calls the day after a holiday when something went sideways. Give me until after that. David nodded and picked up his coffee. My father called at 10:15. Your mother is upset, he said without greeting. You've been distant. We need you at Christmas. I was standing at the kitchen window watching David cross the yard toward the greenhouse, his breath visible in the cold morning air. I'll come if David is treated like family, I said. He is treated like family. The patience in my father's voice had an edge under it now, something that had been there for a while and was not bothering to hide itself anymore. He's treated exactly like what he is, a son-in-law who chose to be a farmer. That's not what I'm asking, Dad. Then what are you asking, Hillary? Because I've been trying to understand what it is you want from us, and I genuinely cannot tell. I'm asking you to see him. A silence. Not the calculating kind. The kind that means the person on the other end of the line has already decided something and is waiting for the conversation to catch up. I see him fine, my father said. I just don't see the point. I went to Christmas alone. David and I decided together, the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with our hands around mugs that had gone cold while we talked. He was not hurt about it, or if he was, he filed it somewhere I could not reach, which was its own kind of answer. Go, he said, see what it is. And I understood that he meant something more than the holiday, that he was giving me the chance to know for certain what I already knew, because knowing for certain was different from suspecting, and I had been suspecting for a long time. My parents' house in Greenwich was decorated the way it was decorated every year, a 12-foot tree in the front hallway, white lights, ornaments my mother had been collecting since before I was born. The smell of it hit me when I walked in, pine and wood smoke and the particular spice of whatever my mother put in the mulled cider she made every Christmas Eve. I had grown up inside that smell. Some part of me still loved it with the helpless love of a person who cannot separate a place from what happened inside it. Trent was already there. Of course he was. He and my father were in the study with drinks, and I could hear them from the hallway. My father's laugh, the particular generous laugh he used with men he wanted to keep, the kind I had not heard directed at David once in 18 months of marriage. Ava was in the kitchen with my mother, the two of them moving around each other with the easy choreography of people who had been doing this together for years. I hung up my coat. I poured myself a glass of water. I smiled at the right moments through cocktails and the first half of dinner, and I watched my family be exactly themselves, and I told myself it was going to be all right. Then my father set down his fork. He did it with the deliberateness of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. The table was full. My parents, Ava, Trent, an uncle and his wife, 2 cousins home from college. 12 people. 12 witnesses. I've been meaning to talk about the family trust, he said. I want everyone to understand my intentions while I'm in good health and things are clear. The room shifted. The specific shift that happens when someone with authority begins a sentence that ends in consequences. Going forward, my father said, Ava and Trent will manage the estate, the property, the holdings, the oversight of the trust. They have the structure, the partnership, the capacity to steward it responsibly. He picked up his wine glass. He did not look at me when he said the next part. It's important to me that the family's legacy be in capable hands. The room was very quiet. What about me? I said. My father looked at me then. His expression was not cruel. That was the thing I kept coming back to later, in the truck, on the highway, in the dark. It was not cruel. It was settled. The expression of a man who has made a decision he considers reasonable and does not expect to revisit. You chose your path, Hillary, he said. A farm in the middle of nowhere. I'm not going to pretend that's a legacy. Nobody spoke. Ava was looking at her plate. Trent had the careful, neutral face of a man who had been briefed on this in advance and had decided his job tonight was to be invisible. My uncle's wife reached for her wine. My cousins looked at the tablecloth. Nobody defended me. Not one word. Not from Ava, who had known me for 28 years. Not from my mother, who was nodding slowly at her husband's profile with the expression of a woman who had agreed to this before I walked through the door. Not from anyone at that table who had known me my entire life. I was being cut out, not just from the money, which I had not expected and had not planned my life around, but from the story, from the official version of this family's future, the one that would be written down in legal documents and told to grandchildren and referenced at future tables just like this one. I was being edited out in real time in front of 12 people, and not one of them found it worth the cost of a word. I finished my water. I set the glass down. After dinner, my mother found me in the kitchen. She came in quietly, the way she moved when she wanted to deliver something without witnesses. She closed the door behind her and leaned against the counter and looked at me with an expression that I recognized, the expression of a woman who believed she was being kind. Don't take it personally, she said. He's disinheriting me. He's protecting the family's future. She said it gently. Gently was always worse. There's a distinction. From me? I said. He's protecting the family's future from me? She crossed the kitchen and reached up and touched my face. The gesture of a mother, palm against cheek, a brief warm pressure, but there was nothing in it. No warmth that reached anywhere it needed to reach. It was performed tenderness, the same way everything tonight had been performed, and I had been watching the performance long enough that I could see the edges of it now, where the seams showed. From your choices, darling, she said, there's a difference. I reached up and took her hand and removed it from my face. No, I said, there isn't. I picked up my bag from the chair where I had left it. I walked down the hallway past the 12-foot tree with its white lights and its 30 years of collected ornaments and its smell of pine and wood smoke and everything I had ever wanted this family to be. I opened the front door. I did not say goodbye to anyone because there was no version of goodbye I could have managed. That would not have cost me something I needed for the drive home. The highway was empty at that hour, Christmas Eve, bleeding into Christmas morning, and I drove the 2.5 hours with the radio off, and my hands at 10 and 2, and my mind doing the thing it does when it is too full to organize itself. Cycling through the same images in the same order, the same moment of my father's settled face, my mother's performed palm, my sister's eyes on her plate. I pulled into the farm driveway and sat in the truck for 20 minutes with the engine off. The cold came in fast. I could see my breath. The farmhouse lights were on. David had left the porch light and the kitchen light the way he always did when I drove home after dark, and the yellow of them against the black of the fields was the most real thing I had seen all night. He came out when he heard the truck. He walked down the porch steps in his flannel and his boots and opened the driver's side door and did not ask what happened because he had understood before I left that whatever happened would be this. And he had sent me anyway because I had needed to know for certain. He held me there in the cold, in the driveway, with the fields dark around us and the porch light throwing our shadow long across the gravel. I did not cry. I was past crying. I had lost my family. Not to anything that could be grieved cleanly, not to death or distance or a single catastrophic rupture, but to choice. Their choice, made over years, made again tonight with a fork set down and a wine glass raised and 12 people who said nothing. That was the loss. Not dramatic, just final. I did not know yet that it was also the beginning. He told me the next morning. We sat at the kitchen table, the two of us, with coffee and the particular quiet of a house the morning after something hard. Outside the kitchen window, the fields were pale with frost, the cover crops silver at the tips, the sky, the flat white of a day that had not decided yet what it wanted to be. David set his mug down. "There are things about me you don't know," he said. "Not because I was hiding them from you, because I needed to know something first." I looked at him across the table. "I needed to know that you loved the version of me that had nothing," he said. "The farmer, the muddy boots, the truck with the broken heater. I needed to know that was enough for you before I showed you anything else." "David, I know how that sounds. Tell me what you're telling me." He told me about Wilson Agricultural Systems. He told it quietly, the way he did everything. No preamble, no performance, just the facts in order. The company he had founded at 27, the agricultural technology division that now operated across 14 states, the export arm, the research partnerships, the subsidiary structure that kept the WAS name out of the headlines and his own name further back still. The valuation, as of the last funding round, $1.2 billion. I sat with that number and felt it rearrange something in my understanding of the last 18 months. Every dinner, every farm tour, every moment my father had looked at David's calloused hands and found them lacking. I thought about the aerial photograph on our wall, the one my mother had called a lovely print. I thought about my father asking what's the revenue on something like this and David saying enough. "You tested me," I said. "No." He said it immediately, without defensiveness. "I tested them." I looked at him across the table and felt something that I did not have a clean name for. Not anger exactly, though there was anger in it, and not relief, though relief was there too, somewhere underneath everything else. I pushed back my chair and stood up. "Give me a few minutes," I said. I went out to the porch. The cold hit me when I opened the door. The real cold of a December morning on a working farm, the kind that has no interest in your feelings and will freeze the water in the greenhouse lines if you are not paying attention. I sat on the top step and looked out at the frost-pale fields and breathed it in and let myself be angry in the way I could not be in the kitchen, where David was sitting with his coffee and his patience and his 1.2 billion reasons why none of the last 18 months had been what I thought it was. The anger was real. I wanted to be clear about that, even to myself. What he had done, running a test on my family, watching them fail it, letting them keep failing it through Thanksgiving and Christmas, and every small cruelty in between, without telling me. That was not nothing. He had sat at my father's table and let my father call him a joke and said soil remembers, and I had thought it was just David being David, and it had been something else entirely. I sat on that step for 10 minutes, maybe 12. Then I went back inside. He was exactly where I had left him. He had not filled my coffee or moved my chair or done any of the small managing things that people do when they are trying to control how a conversation lands. He was just sitting there with his mug, waiting for me the way he always waited for things, without performing the waiting. I stood in the doorway. "Show me," I said. He opened his laptop and turned it so I could see. And for the next 40 minutes, he walked me through the structure of Wilson Agricultural Systems, the way he would have walked a client through a soil report. Methodically, without dramatizing, letting the information be what it was. The subsidiary companies, the acquisition pipeline, the shell structure that kept the corporate footprint clean and the ownership private. And then, near the end, a folder labeled Williams Capital Group. Your father's company has been over-leveraged for at least 2 years, David said. It became public knowledge in certain financial circles about 18 months ago. My CFO flagged it. He paused. There was an opportunity. I made a decision. He showed me the debt acquisition, the quiet accumulation over 18 months of Williams Capital's distressed obligations through a WAS subsidiary, the majority position that WAS now held in my father's financial life without my father knowing anything about it. I looked at the numbers for a long time. How much do you own? I said finally. Enough, he said. The same word he had given my father in our kitchen while my father laughed about college tuition. I understood now what David had meant when he said soil remembers. Not patience, not a farming metaphor, a statement of intent delivered to a man who would not understand it until it was too late to matter. I should have been angrier. Maybe I was, somewhere underneath. But what I felt most, sitting there at the kitchen table with the frost-pale fields outside the window and the open laptop between us, was something closer to clarity. The long, slow arrival of a thing I had been approaching for a long time without knowing I was moving. David's mother called that afternoon. Ruth Wilson was 67 years old and had the particular directness of a woman who had spent a career in agricultural science and had run out of patience for anything that wasted her time, including, as she had once told me, most social conventions. She arrived at the farm in the early evening with a loaf of bread she had baked that morning and a bottle of wine she considered adequate, and the expression of a woman who already knew most of what was happening and had come anyway because she thought it mattered. We sat at the kitchen table with the wine poured and the bread between us, and she told me her story. She had married David's father when she was 24. The Wilsons at that time had money. Old agricultural money. The kind that had been accumulating since before the Depression. Grain elevators and commodity contracts and land holdings across 3 Midwestern states. Ruth's family had a failing farm in Iowa and 2 daughters, and a father who had been trying to sell the mineral rights for a decade. When she married into the Wilson family, his mother had told her, in the particular language of women who know how to wound without raising their voices, that she would drag the name down. I spent 20 years proving her wrong, Ruth said. She held her wine glass without drinking from it, turning it slowly, built a career, raised a son, watched the farm turn into something real. She set the glass down. By the time she admitted it, I didn't need to hear it anymore. That was the thing she never understood. By the time you've proven it, you don't need the acknowledgement. You've already moved past needing it. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was dry and firm, the grip of a woman who had spent her life working with her hands. You don't need their words, sweetheart, she said. You just need your own. I sat with that for a long time after she left. David cleaned up the kitchen. I stayed at the table with the last of my wine and the dark window and the fields beyond it, and I thought about what I needed and what I had been spending my energy looking for in the wrong places. Later, when the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, I found David in the front room. I don't want to destroy them, I said. I know. But I don't want to hide anymore either. He looked at me for a moment. Then don't. I thought about the aerial photograph on the wall. The one my mother had called a lovely print, the one that was not Kansas. The Forbes feature, I said, the under 40 list. You said they'd been asking. 2 years, he said. I've been saying no. I looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching me the way he watched things he was waiting to understand. Say yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the frost-pale field sat still and cold and patient, growing things nobody could see yet. You sure? He said. I thought about my father's fork set down with its 2 minutes of Ashford praise and its half-second glance at my husband's calloused hands. I thought about my mother's palm on my cheek, warm and empty. I thought about 12 people, and not one word. Soil remembers, I said. It was the first time I had said it back to him. He went very still for a moment, and then something shifted in his face that I had not seen before. Not the composure I was used to, not the patience, but something underneath those things. Something that had been held a long time and was only now being set down. He smiled. It was the first time I had seen him look relieved. Oscar Reed drove up from the city on a Thursday morning in January, 3 weeks after David said yes to Forbes. He arrived in a dark sedan he had clearly rented at the airport, which told me he had flown, which told me this meeting mattered enough that he had not wanted to spend 4 hours on the train. I had spoken to Oscar twice before, briefly, in the way you speak to someone who occupies the professional edge of your husband's life. Competent, formal, precise in the way that people are precise when precision is their instrument. He was 50 years old and looked it in the way that men look their age when they have spent those years doing serious work. Gray at the temples. Good shoes. A handshake that was exactly as firm as it needed to be and not 1 degree warmer. David met him at the door. They went to the kitchen table, which had become, in the last 3 weeks, something of a war room. Laptops and printed documents and coffee cups that accumulated and were cleared and accumulated again. I sat across from Oscar, and he looked at me with the same directness he gave David and began. Williams Capital Group's financial position, as of that Thursday in January, was as follows. 3 major clients had withdrawn their accounts in the preceding 8 months, citing concerns about the firm's strategic direction, which was the polished language investors used when they meant they had lost confidence in leadership. 2 commercial real estate development loans that Williams Capital had co-signed were underperforming. The firm's debt-to-equity ratio had crossed the threshold that typically triggered covenant reviews with their primary lender, and my father had spent the last 4 months managing that conversation with an optimism that Oscar described, without editorializing, as not supported by the underlying numbers. He had been looking for outside investment. He had been looking hard. Meridian Partners has been his primary contact for the last 3 months, Oscar said. He set a folder on the table between us. They've had 4 meetings. He's provided full financial disclosure. He believes Meridian is an independent agricultural investment group with strong regional ties and a particular interest in Connecticut financial infrastructure. I looked at the folder. Meridian is ours, David said. Oscar nodded. A WAS subsidiary established 14 months ago. The name was selected to be unremarkable. A pause. Your father has never asked who owns it. He asked about their capital base, their timeline, their terms. He did not ask about their principles. That was my father exactly. He would have asked the questions that confirmed what he wanted to believe and not the questions that might have complicated the answer. What are the terms? I asked. Oscar turned a page in the folder. Controlling interest in Williams Capital Group in exchange for a capital injection sufficient to resolve the covenant issue with the primary lender and stabilize the firm's operational runway for 24 months. A board restructuring. A management review at the 12-month mark. He signs Thursday, Oscar said. David looked at me across the table. Let him, I said. Oscar gathered his folder and his precise handshake and his rented dark sedan and drove back toward the highway, and David and I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet that followed and did not say much. Because there was not much that needed saying. The mechanism had been running for 18 months. It would run for 3 more days, and then it would stop being a mechanism and start being a fact. And facts, as David had once said to me in a different context, do not require your participation to be true. Thursday came. I did not know the exact moment my father signed. I was at a client site in the morning walking the edge field of a 400-acre operation that was transitioning out of conventional tillage, taking soil samples in the cold. My hands inside my gloves and my boots leaving prints in the half-frozen ground. My phone was in my pocket and I did not check it. That evening, David told me Oscar had confirmed the signatures were complete. My father had apparently called my mother from the conference room while the ink was still fresh. David learned this later, through channels I did not ask about in detail. John had called Laura from the conference room while the ink was still fresh, relieved, telling her they were saved. He had sounded, by all accounts, like a man who had solved a difficult problem through his own efforts, which was the version of the story he would continue to tell himself for exactly 11 more days. He had never once looked at who was behind Meridian. He had not asked because the answer had not occurred to him as a question worth asking. Some people are so accustomed to not looking beneath the surface of things that the habit becomes invisible to them, and they navigate the world by its surfaces alone, and it works well enough until it doesn't. The Forbes crew arrived on a Monday. There were 4 of them: a journalist, a photographer, a videographer, and a production assistant who handled logistics with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times. They were professional and low-key, and they treated the farm the way good journalists treat a subject, which is to say with genuine curiosity rather than the performed kind. David walked them through the operation the same way he had walked my parents through it 3 months earlier. The lower fields, the soil lab, the greenhouse, the cover crops just beginning to show the first pale suggestion of green against the winter ground. He interviewed in his work clothes. I watched from the porch with Ruth, who had driven over that morning and was drinking tea from the thermos she brought everywhere and watching her son with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had waited a long time for something she always knew was coming. The journalist was good. She asked the questions that got at the substance of things rather than the surface, and David answered them in the way he answered everything, directly, without performance, letting the silence after a question sit for as long as it needed to sit before he spoke into it. He talked about soil biology. He talked about the economics of long-term regenerative investment versus the short-term extraction model that had degraded so much agricultural land across the country. He talked about building something that would still be working in 100 years. Then the journalist asked about acquisitions. David paused. Not hesitation. The specific pause of a man choosing his words because words are instruments and he wanted the right one. A Connecticut investment firm, he said. Good bones. Bad leadership. The journalist waited. She had good instincts. What attracted you to a firm outside agriculture? She asked. Personal interest, David said. Ruth made a small sound beside me that was not quite a laugh. Later, after the crew had packed their equipment and the sedan had turned out of the driveway and the farm had settled back into itself, Ruth set her thermos down on the porch railing and looked at me. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it honestly, the way she always expected you to think about things. Like I'm about to walk into the room my parents built, I said, and turn on the lights. Ruth looked at me for a moment. That's exactly what you're doing, she said. I did not call my family. I did not warn them. I did not send a text or leave a voicemail or give them any of the preparation they had never once thought to give me. Through 18 months of parties and galas and Thanksgiving tables and Christmas dinners where I had shown up again and again, hoping that this time someone would see what I had built and decide it was worth seeing. They would find out the way everyone else found out. The Forbes Under 40 episode aired on a Tuesday evening in late January, prime time, the kind of slot the network reserved for profiles they expected to perform. I watched it from the farmhouse couch, with David beside me and the dog asleep across both our feet, and the fire going in the wood stove in the corner. The production was good. They opened with aerial footage, wide sweeping the camera, pulling back from a single field to reveal the scale of the operation. 14 states rendered in that particular way that makes you understand something about size that numbers alone cannot convey. Then the shot tightened on a framed photograph hanging on a farmhouse wall. Vast farmland from above, pale and dark fields in alternating bands, stretching toward what looked like the edge of the world. The same photograph my mother had stood in front of 3 months ago in this same room and called a lovely print. The narration said, "This is what $1.2 billion looks like when it doesn't want to be noticed." I felt David's shoulder against mine. The segment ran 22 minutes. It covered the founding of Wilson Agricultural Systems, the 14-state operation, the technology licensing division, the export partnerships, It covered David's decision at 25 to walk away from Wilson Grains International, his family's legacy agribusiness conglomerate, and build something from nothing in the soil of a concept most agribusiness money considered marginal. It covered, briefly, Waz's most recent acquisition, Williams Capital Group, the journalist's voice said, a mid-tier Connecticut investment firm, became Waz's most recent portfolio addition in January, in a transaction described by the company as a strategic expansion into financial infrastructure supporting regional agricultural supply chains. The camera held on David's face. Calm, no gloating, just the face of a man who has done what he said he would do and finds the doing sufficient. My phone lit up on the cushion beside me. Not mine, at first. David's. Then mine. The family group chat, the one I had been removed from 2 years ago, following a disagreement about Thanksgiving that had been framed, at the time, as a mutual decision to take some space, had a new notification. I had been re-added silently the week before, without announcement, by Ava, who I suspected had done it in a moment of either guilt or calculation, and had not mentioned it to our parents. John, Hillary, call me. Now, Laura, where are you? Ava, did you know about this? Laura, Hillary, please. John, we need to talk about this immediately. Call me. I read each message. I read them in order, slowly, the way you read things you want to be sure you are understanding correctly. The fire crackled in the wood stove. The daub shifted across our feet. David sat beside me and did not say anything, which was the right thing. On the television, the journalist's final question, what drives you? David on screen, in his work clothes, in the field he had built from nothing. He looked into the camera with the same expression he had worn at my father's dinner table when my father made his joke about the tractor. Unhurried. Taking up exactly the space he needed and not 1 inch more. Soil remembers everything you put into it, he said. So do people. I married a woman whose family told her she chose wrong. She chose me, and I spent every day since making sure she never had reason to doubt that choice. The camera held on his face. I reached for the remote and paused it. Not because I was sad, because I needed a moment to be inside the feeling of being seen, truly seen, not performed at, or managed, or tolerated, or strategically included when the optics required it, but seen. Someone had said it out loud, on national television, in a voice that did not waver. For the first time in 33 years, I had been spoken about as though I were worth protecting. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone. I read my father's messages again, my mother's. Ava's escalating series of question marks arranged into words. I thought about the engagement party in Greenwich. I thought about the toast and the laughter and my mother's shoulders shaking behind her fingers. I thought about the white linen at a working farm and the farm tour with hands in jacket pockets and the aerial photograph called a lovely print. I thought about Christmas Eve and a fork set down and a wine glass raised and 12 people who said nothing. I typed one character, a small smiling face. The quiet kind, not the laughing one. The emoji you use when you have nothing left to explain and no interest in explaining it. I set the phone face down on the cushion. I reached for the glass of water on the side table and set it back down. My hand was steady. Nothing cracked. David was watching me. Done? He said. I looked at him. I looked at the paused frame on the television, his face in the field, calm and certain and entirely himself. Done, I said. The calls came for 3 days. I did not answer them, not out of cruelty, or not only that, mostly because I had spent 33 years answering, when my family called, showing up when they needed the room, managed absorbing what they needed to put down. And I found that I did not have the particular kind of energy it would take to answer these calls, while also remaining the person I had spent the last several months becoming. So I let them go to voicemail. I watched the notifications accumulate on my phone with the same detached attention I gave a soil report that was telling me something I had already suspected. The farm had its own rhythm, and I moved inside it. David was up before dawn every morning, the way he always was, and I had learned in 18 months of marriage to follow that rhythm rather than resist it. I was at my desk by 7 with coffee and client files, and by 8 I was usually out in the field or on a call with a farmer 3 counties over who was trying to understand why his cover crop wasn't establishing the way the agronomist had promised. The work was specific and absorbing, and it asked things of me that I could actually give, which was more than I could say for most of what my family had asked of me over the years. A week after the broadcast, Oscar Reed called David. I was in the greenhouse when it happened, checking the humidity levels on the seedling trays we had started for early spring. David came to find me 20 minutes later. He stood in the greenhouse doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets, a gesture I recognized, the one that meant he was organizing something before he said it. "Your father took the meeting," he said. John Williams had driven into the city that morning and met Oscar Reed at the Williams Capital offices, which were no longer, in any meaningful sense, Williams Capital's offices. Oscar had arrived first, which was intentional. He had chosen the conference room, which was also intentional. When my father walked in expecting a conversation with the managing partner of his rescue investor, he found instead a presentation that began with the WAS logo and did not require much additional explanation. David told me what Oscar had reported back. My father had sat very still for the first several minutes. Then he had asked, with the controlled voice of a man who understood that how he handled the next 30 seconds would define how the rest of this conversation went, whether this was a negotiation. Oscar had told him it was not. 2 options. Resignation with severance, the terms of which were fair by any standard measurement and slightly better than he deserved by Oscar's private assessment. Or a transition into a regional division manager role, reporting to Oscar, at a salary that was respectable and a title that was not. "I built this company," my father had said. "You leveraged it into the ground," Oscar had said. "Mr. Wilson rebuilt it. My father had chosen to stay. I stood in the greenhouse with the humidity at 62 and the seedling trays quietly doing their work, and I let that land." He had nowhere else to go. That was the truth of it, underneath all the other truths. John Williams was 62 years old, and his reputation in Connecticut financial circles had absorbed a blow from which it would not recover quickly. Because the Forbes piece had been specific about Williams Capital's financial condition, and specific about the acquisition, and specific by implication about the quality of leadership that had made the acquisition possible. The men who had deferred to him at club dinners for 20 years would continue to be polite, because that was what those men did. But the calls would stop coming, and the deals would stop finding their way to his desk, and he would understand, without anyone saying it directly, that the territory had shifted under him in a way that territory does not unshift. He would sit in a smaller office on a lower floor and answer to a man who answered to his son-in-law. Every morning. Indefinitely. Oscar told me about the office later, not with any satisfaction. Oscar Reed was not a man who gloated. He mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, as a fact among other facts, because I had asked. The office was on the 4th floor. The old one had been on the 7th, corner position, windows on 2 sides, the kind of view that communicates something to the people sitting across the desk from you before anyone has spoken a word. The new one faced the parking garage. 1 window, a desk that was adequate, a chair that was the same model as the ones in the conference rooms, which meant it had been selected by a procurement department for durability rather than for what it said about the person sitting in it. My father had stood in the doorway of that office for a long moment, Oscar said, before he walked in and sat down. On the desk was a single manila folder. Inside it, the first form he needed to sign in his new capacity. Standard paperwork. Reporting structure, direct supervisor, the scope of his new role. His signature line was at the bottom, below Oscar's printed name and title. John Williams, 62 years old, who had built a company from a leveraged idea and a Connecticut address book and 20 years of club dinners and handshakes, signed his name below the name of his son-in-law's CFO and pushed the folder back across the desk. Oscar said he did it without a word. That, I thought, was its own kind of answer. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had expected satisfaction, or something in the neighborhood of it, the clean, specific pleasure of an outcome that matches what was deserved, What I felt instead was quieter, more like the feeling after a long illness passes when the body is not yet well but the fever has broken and the direction has changed. My mother's boards were quieter about it. She told me herself, which I had not expected. She texted on a Wednesday evening, the text arriving while I was washing dishes after dinner, the kind of text that takes longer to write than its length suggests. We should talk. I think there have been misunderstandings. I dried my hands. I read it twice. I set the phone on the counter and finished the dishes, and then I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in front of me for a while, thinking about the word misunderstandings and what it cost a woman like my mother to use it, and what it revealed that she had chosen it over any of the other words available to her. 3 days later, I wrote back. There were no misunderstandings, Mom. You understood exactly what you were doing. I set the phone face down after I sent it and went back to the client report I had been working on and did not pick it up again for 2 hours. When I did, there was no reply. There was not one that evening, or the next morning, or the several days after that. For the first time in her life, my mother had nothing to say. I understood what that cost her. I did not think it was enough, but I understood it. Ava called on a Saturday. I was in the barn, working on the equipment inventory we did every February before the season ramped up, when my phone rang with her name on it. I sat on an overturned feed bucket with the barn cold around me and the smell of soil and oil and old wood in the air, and I answered. She was crying before she finished saying my name. The Ashford family had been polite about it. That was the word Ava used. Polite. They had been very polite in the way they stopped returning her calls about wedding venues. Very polite in the way Trent had become harder to reach, his texts arriving later and shorter, the warmth cooling in the particular calibrated way of a man whose family had advised him to recalibrate. The engagement was not officially over. It was suspended in the specific social limbo of something that everyone understood was ending, and no one wanted to be the first to name. Her sponsorship contracts had started sending the polite emails too. 3 brands in 2 weeks, all variations of the same language about strategic realignment and audience fit, and perhaps revisiting the partnership at a later date. Her comments section had shifted. The algorithm, which had no opinions of its own but reflected the opinions of everyone else with mechanical efficiency, had begun surfacing older posts. The yacht, the family goals caption, the string of celebrations that had no Hillary in them, alongside newer commentary from people who had done the arithmetic. You could have told me, she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had genuinely not seen it coming, and I believed her. That was the thing about Ava. She was not calculating in the way my parents were calculating. She was simply someone who had taken the world as it was arranged and lived inside it without questioning the arrangement, and now the arrangement had changed, and she was in the cold of it without a coat. You could have invited me, I said. The silence after that was different from the silence I was used to from my family. This one was honest. Ava had many qualities that drove me to the edge of myself, but she had never been good at lying. Not really. Not when she was genuinely surprised. I had surprised her. Not with the Forbes reveal, which had surprised everyone, but with those 4 words which named something she had been hoping I would not name. Are you going to ruin my life? She said. I thought about the yacht. I thought about 6 Instagram frames and a champagne emoji and the words family goals applied to a gathering I had not been invited to. I thought about the Christmas table and my sister's eyes on her plate while our father edited me out of the family story. No, I said. Your life was a rented yacht, Ava. I'm just not paying for the fuel. She didn't respond to that. After a moment, I heard her breathing slow, and I knew she was deciding something, working out whether this was an ending or a beginning or something else that didn't have a clean name yet. I didn't know the answer either. What I knew was that it was honest, which was more than most of what had passed between us in the last several years. We said goodbye without resolving anything. Some things don't resolve on the first call. Maybe some things don't resolve at all, and you learn to live alongside them the way you learn to work around a stone in a field, not removing it. Just understanding where it is so you stop breaking tools against it. That evening, I sat on the porch, the same porch where I had seen the yacht photos, the same steps, the same view of the lower fields, which were dark now in the February evening, the cover crops invisible from here but present underneath. doing the slow, patient work of restoring what the previous season had taken out of the soil. Same boots, same coffee, going cold in my hand. But I was not the woman who had sat here in October and let the exclusion settle into her chest like a stone. I could feel the difference in the quality of the quiet around me. October had been the quiet of someone waiting to be included. This was something else. David came out 20 minutes after I did and sat on the step beside me, close enough that his shoulder was against mine. He had his own coffee. He did not ask what I was thinking, because in 18 months he had learned the difference between a silence that needed opening and a silence that needed company. The fields stretched out ahead of us, dark and cold and working. My phone buzzed. I already knew what it was. The family group chat, still active, the one I had been re-added to the week before the broadcast. Another message, probably my father, probably another variation of the call me or we need to talk, or this cannot go unanswered, as though the conversation were a debt that had not been paid rather than a bill I had decided to stop collecting. I did not check it. I already knew what it said. I looked out at the field and thought about what David had said on national television, in front of however many people had been watching, in the plain voice he used for things he meant without reservation. She chose me, and I spent every day since making sure she never had reason to doubt that choice. I thought about 33 years of trying to be enough for people who had decided before I walked into any room that enough was not what I was. I thought about all the apologies I had made on behalf of a life they had never tried to understand, all the tables I had shown up to, all the calls I had answered, all the times I had stood in a hallway listening to applause on the other side of a door that had just closed in my face. I thought about a cracked champagne glass and a hand that held mine steady. The field was dark. The cover crops were there anyway, in the cold, in the ground, doing what they do. Still out there, I said. David looked at the field. Always is, he said. I took a sip of the cold coffee and held it there for a moment and thought about what it means to grow something in soil that other people have given up on. They spent 33 years teaching me I was not enough. Turns out they were right. I was never enough for them. I was always too much.